What's up, everybody? Pat from Subversive History here. Today we're going to be looking at an interesting TikTok that was sent to me. This particular video is by the Libertarian creator PraxBen, and it focuses on the Indian state of Kerala. Now, I take issue with a number of Ben's claims in this video, and we will be reviewing them point by point. Now, while there will be some entertainment value in this type of juvenile response video, I hope this will also serve a more educational purpose, and that those who watch it will come away with a slightly better understanding of Kerala. In addition to general education, this video is intended as a broad investigation into how some creators can manipulate and distort seemingly credible sources, play fast and loose with statistics, and conflate correlation with causation. Before we get into the specifics of Ben's video, you may be asking yourself, what qualifies me, of all people, to speak as some kind of an authority on Kerala? Well, the answer to that is nothing, formally. Although I have read several books on the Indian state of Kerala, as well as an additional number of books on the Indian subcontinent more broadly, as well as a number of academic journals regarding the topic. In addition to that, I have also spent a month in Kerala myself, where I conducted interviews with a number of CPIM party members, as well as other politicians from the state. Here's actually a photo of me on the cover of an Indian newspaper. I'm shaking hands with a Gandhi impersonator. So that's fun. So I will be drawing on that experience, as well as some of the things that I've read either in books or academic journals, to rebut some of Ben's claims here in this video.
How does the Indian state of Kerala have a higher human development index than some European countries?
Obviously, it's because they're communist, or at least that's what she's going to try to argue. But you can't really argue that when you get your very first claim wrong. Their Human Development Index score is 0.752, which is not very far above Goa. This is only higher than one European country, that's Azerbaijan, which coincidentally happens to be a former Soviet satellite state, as are most of the lower-ranking European countries. But yeah, that's just a coincidence, obviously.
Okay, just to begin here. Referring to Kerala simply as communist is somewhat misleading, and this goes for Ben or someone else that may be praising Kerala. Doing it on the basis of communism leaves a lot of the detail and nuance off of the table. Kerala does have an extremely popular communist party that has enjoyed large amounts of electoral success throughout the state's independent history. Although it has been popular, it has never maintained consistent long-term power within the state, and for the better part of 4 decades, it has alternated power with the right-wing party, the United Democratic Front. It is only in the most recent election cycle that the Communist Party of India Marxist has been able to win 2 consecutive elections within the state. So in addition to the Communist Party never really having any long-term power within the state, it's also important to keep in mind that Kerala is just a state within the larger capitalist nation of India, meaning that it is subordinate to the larger political structure of the nation state. This kind of dynamic really impedes the implementation of any quote-unquote communism. For example, after 1957, when the CPIM won its first election, it made a generous land reform proposal, which was vetoed by the then Prime Minister of India. This dynamic and its challenges are detailed by the former Finance Minister of Kerala. The Communist Party in Kerala has functioned under the conditions of a liberal democracy, relying on success in multi-party elections to remain in power. The Communist Party's 1957 constitution stated it would allow the existence of opposing parties after it had parliamentary majority. This reliance on the people's opinions created a tolerant communist government, but it also made it more difficult to enact radical reforms. Therefore, the reforms of the Communist Party in Kerala were mainly moderately socialist. In spite of all these challenges, the CPIM has achieved significant accomplishments using its electoral platform, and these programs have directly contributed to Kerala's exceptional social metrics, for which it is generally praised for by international institutions. But we will get more into these specifics later in the video. To conclude this point, whether we are talking about Kerala's successes or its failures, it is important to recognize this complex political landscape. So whether it's PraxBen or whatever video he is responding to, referring to Kerala simply as communist does not provide enough nuance to really understand the situation. So before we get into the specifics of HDI, I think it's important that we define what HDI is referring to. The Human Development Index, or HDI, is a statistical composite index of life expectancy, education, and per capita income indicators, which is used to rank countries into 4 tiers of human development. Let's first address the video's claim stating that Kerala has a higher HDI ranking than some European countries. Honestly, I have no idea where the initial video got this information from, and in my opinion, it is somewhat disingenuous and incorrect to frame it this way. So I do not necessarily disagree with Ben's refutation of the overall claim, but my issue is with the general framing of this question and the inaccurate conclusions that it can lead to. When discussing HDI, it is important to keep in mind that India and most Global South nations have a comparatively lower HDI ranking than Western Europe. This is completely uncontroversial. However, this should not be the metric by which we measure Kerala's progress. The fact of the matter is that Kerala enjoys the highest HDI ranking in all of India, and whereas India is ranked 132nd out of 191 countries for HDI, Kerala's HDI is comparable to that of Colombia, which is ranked roughly 50 spots above India. Regardless of how this compares to the more industrially advanced nations of Western Europe, this is extremely impressive when compared to the Indian average and most Asian countries. Pretending that Kerala has not made massive accomplishments in this respect is simply disingenuous.
No, I'm kidding. It's because they were communists. This study of 44 Eurasian countries looks at the effects of communist governments on these countries. And communism was significantly negatively associated with the Human Development Index, as well as the Income Index and Health Index. So your entire argument is debunked right off the bat because communism leads to a lower Human Development Index.
To validate his claims about HDI, Ben cites a study which, according to him, looks at the effects of communist governments on the HDI of 44 Eurasian countries. Now, I have read this entire study, something Ben clearly has not, or perhaps he has and hopes that his audience will not and just take his interpretation at face value. Ben severely misrepresents the purpose of this study in what is tantamount to jamming a square peg in a round hole for the purpose of substantiating his beliefs. The main purpose of this study is to assess whether deep cultural ancestry impacts major aspects of human development. The study uses 3 factors, including communism, as control variables for its main focus, which is cultural ancestry. Furthermore, the study's vague association between communism and decreased development leaves much to be desired. The main reason for this is the fact that the Human Development Project began in the year 1990, which is 1 year prior to the fall of the Soviet Union and the effective end to most of the socialist governance in Eastern Europe. The data in Ben's 2017 study is largely gathered from a time period after these nations had transitioned into capitalism. Also, it should be noted that when the Human Development Project issued its first report in 1990, Cuba, Yugoslavia, USSR, and Eastern Germany were all listed in the high human development category, with Eastern Germany only 2 spots lower than the United States. It is also important to know that this transition to capitalism was extremely traumatic and detrimental to many of the factors directly associated with human development. For example, nearly all post-Soviet states suffered deep and prolonged recessions after neoliberal shock therapy programs, with poverty increasing more than tenfold. The resulting crisis of the 1990s was twice as intense as the Great Depression in the countries of Western Europe and the United States in the 1930s. The cost to human life was profound, as Russia suffered the worst peacetime increase in mortality experienced by any industrialized country. For the years 1987 and 1988, before capitalism, only 2% of the Russian population lived in poverty. By 1993 to 1995, after the transition to capitalism, the poverty rate skyrocketed to 50%. This privatization process resulted in poorer health outcomes in the former Eastern Bloc countries, and the WHO states IMF economic reform programs are associated with significantly worsened tuberculosis incidence, prevalence, and mortality rates in post-communist Eastern European and former Soviet countries. If you're interested in further reading on economic shock therapy, I would suggest reading Revolution from Above by economics professor David Kotz, which focuses specifically on the Soviet Union's experience. For a broader take, I suggest Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which covers the implementation of shock therapy not only in the USSR, but on other nations as well. And an interesting read on the alternative to these economic disasters is How China Escaped Shock Therapy by German economist Isabella Weber. When considering this information, it is essential to keep in mind the specific metrics which aggregate HDI ranking. They include education, income, and health factors. So Eastern Europe's precipitous decline in income, mortality, and health outcomes associated with their transition to capitalism will have a dramatically negative effect on their HDI ranking. This is also all in the period which specifically comprises the HDI project's specific dataset. The study that Ben cites factors none of these significantly crucial contexts into its analysis, and therefore it hardly offers the concrete causality that seems to justify Ben's assertion. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, who am I, of all people, to be criticizing this study from a very credible institution? What qualifies me to suggest that this study has serious deficiencies and should not be used as evidence to advance any claim regarding human development and communism? Well, don't take my word for it. The study itself says exactly that. The study itself states that the countries in the dataset had abandoned communism for most of the years in the dataset, and clarifies its position further with the caveat, it should also be noted, however, that many of the former communist countries, largely those in the former Soviet Union, also suffered major economic turmoil following the demise of their communist governments, and that this too may play a role in explaining the apparent effect of communism on income. Moreover, it must be noted that the communist countries in the sample are all Eastern European and Central Asian, and that these areas were less wealthy than Western Europe even prior to communism. And indeed, Russia saw rapid economic growth following the advent of communism, although this lessened over time. For all these reasons, the results presented here must be treated with caution and are primarily intended as a control in the context of examination of deep cultural effects on human development, not as a thoroughgoing analysis of the effects of communism on development. As you can see here, it can be very convincing to see someone speaking quickly and confidently while pointing to highlighted portions of a study on the screen. However, if someone did not read the study themselves, they would miss all the context which contradicted Ben smugly declaring that
communism leads to a lower human development index.
At this point, I'm forced to speculate that Ben may have presented a study he did not actually read himself, something that would be extremely irresponsible. Or perhaps, even worse, he did actually read the study and just intentionally omitted all the details which deflated his position. It seems like there could be a more reliable way to draw inferences between socialist nations and HDI ranking, instead of flippantly identifying a loose correlation between post-Soviet states ravaged by neoliberal shock therapy and corruption with lower HDI ranking. I would suggest looking at actually existing socialist nations and compare their HDI with the regional average. Luckily for us, the UN Human Development Reports can be conveniently filtered into regional categories. Cuba is a nation that has operated under a socialist system since the 1959 revolution. After about 60 years of socialist governance, Cuba ranks 13th out of 33 countries listed in the Latin American and Caribbean region. This puts the island nation in an above-average HDI ranking compared to the regional average. Furthermore, Cuba far exceeds its direct neighbors such as Jamaica and Haiti, as well as nearby Central American nations like Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Cuba even marginally exceeds the HDI ranking of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. All of these nations are ostensibly capitalist, yet Cuba's citizens enjoy a higher HDI than all of them. This is especially impressive considering Cuba has undergone decades of economic embargo, repeated destabilization campaigns from the USA, and a period of immense economic decline following the fall of the Soviet Union. Just to add a more empirical foundation to these speculations, here is a 2018 study conducted by the University of Windsor, which examined the peculiar situation of Cuba having an impressive HDI ranking despite having a relatively low GDP per capita. According to the study, Cuba continues to have an HDI score well above what one would expect from a country of its GDP. It goes on to say, these results are due to a combination of factors, many of them based in the state's Marxist-Leninist ideology, specifically a combination of equitable land reform, a strong welfare state, and smart prioritization and allocation of government resources work together to deliver a high degree of human development. Cuba is by no means a perfect system with a perfect economy, but its resilience and perpetually above average standard of living are quite damning to Ben's declaration that
communism leads to a lower human development index.
Just in case I have not included enough evidence for this point, let's quickly look at a second example of communist governance which still exists today, China. China ranks 5th out of 24 countries in the East Asia and Pacific region. This is well above average for the area. According to a 2023 study on China's human development, the research concluded, recent empirical evidence from China suggests that China's achievements in HDI are not only due to economic growth, but are also ascribable to the particular attention that the Chinese government has paid to the investment in education and healthcare for poverty reduction compared with other developing countries. I would also like to mention that communist-governed Vietnam falls squarely in the regional median, and Laos falls well below average. So in full transparency, this correlation may be inconclusive and more variables would need to be considered in the East Asia region. So just to conclude this portion on HDI, we began by recognizing that Kerala has the highest HDI ranking in all of India. Ben then proceeds to debunk the association between communism and high human development by evoking a study which in its body explicitly states that it should not be used for exactly that purpose. Ben hyper-focuses on this study, which only looks at a relatively small sample of nations that have not been communist for over 2 decades, and compares them to the most industrially advanced nations in the world. These are very complex topics that simply cannot be adequately covered in short-form video content, especially when the presenter is extremely disingenuous.
They have maintained a high minimum wage with strong labor and trade unions and land reforms. They made sure everyone has access to electricity and water, with all villages and cities being electrified and 91% of rural towns having access to drinking water.
Those minimum wages and trade unions aren't doing very much since they come in 12th for income in India.
So this is an interesting take from Ben. Ben attempts to refute the claim that labor unions and minimum wage have contributed to a decently high income for the people of Kerala by pointing out that the state ranks only 12th out of India for income, which is true, but he doesn't mention that there are 33 states in India, which means ranking 12th puts them well above the Indian average for income. Looking at a percentage, Kerala makes more income than 64% of India. I'm not sure what kind of epic debunking it is to point this out, but it seems like the unions are doing quite well, all things considered. Secondly, one extremely important thing that Ben failed to mention is that despite being ranked only 12th in income, Kerala has the least amount of citizens living in poverty in all of India. Literally, the least impoverished state in all of India. It's kind of a weird thing to leave out of the discussion, but it's also extremely detrimental to Ben's point. At this point, I'm not even sure if he's trying, but let's move on to his take on electricity.
But hey, on the electricity point, it's true. Their citizens do have access to electricity, as do the citizens of every single other Indian state. So that's not really impressive.
This claim is perhaps the most detrimental to Ben's credibility, in my opinion. He pulls up the Wikipedia page which ranks Indian states by access to electricity, and then proceeds to brazenly dismiss Kerala's achievements in the field of electrification by pointing out that all Indian states have 100% access to electricity, which is true as of the year 2019. Ben conveniently ignores the rest of the graph which he chose to display, which accounts for a broader time frame. So let's take a more detailed look at the graph which Ben chose to substantiate his criticism of Kerala's electricity achievements. If we look just to the right of the section Ben pointed out, we can see that as of 2016, Kerala was the only state in all of India to have achieved 100% electrification. Furthermore, we can see that for the entire data set of the graph, Kerala was one of the most electrified states in all of India. The graph also averages the data for all of India, and we can see that as of 2001, Kerala had almost double the access to electricity as the Indian average. I don't know about you, but in my opinion, being the first state in the entire country to achieve full electrification is pretty impressive. And also, having twice the Indian average at the turn of the century is also pretty impressive. But according to Ben,
so that's not really impressive.
These examples really lay bare the flaws with TikTok political content, and how disingenuous creators such as PraxBen can exploit them. For both wages and electricity, Ben essentially presented data which contradicts the point that he was trying to make to his audience. But because of the fast-paced style of TikTok, many viewers will come away convinced of his erroneous position. Spending even 30 seconds to examine these claims will reveal how hollow they actually are, and frankly, Ben should be ashamed for peddling them so carelessly to his audience.
For the water thing, I can't really find anything favorable on water in Kerala. Their quality was the worst in India in 2014. More recent data from 2021 shows that several states are ahead of them in sanitation and clean water. This government website shows only 34.26% of households in the state have provision of tap water supply, and that's 2021. But hey, there's other sources of clean water, like wells, for example. But it turns out most of the dug up wells in Kerala have fecal contamination due to poor or poorly maintained sanitation facilities. So the government is not doing a very good job of managing sanitation. It's probably partially because of their unwillingness to conquer nature. So much for that degrowth, am I right?
I really don't have much to add here on the water topic. Ben is largely correct in his criticism of Kerala's access to water. Kerala is ranked the lowest in all of India in terms of access to clean drinking water. This needs to be recognized, and Kerala has a lot of work to do in this respect. These are just the facts of the matter.
Our motto has been education for everyone, forever. It is for this reason that Kerala has the highest literacy rate in all of India at 94%.
In the places that they actually do well, like literacy, this isn't because of the Marxists or because of the government. Historian Robert Woodbury has many great papers on the rise of literacy in different countries. And in Kerala and India in general, he shows that it was actually Christian missionaries that led to higher literacy rates. Missionaries which were very much concentrated in places like Kerala and Goa. And it's not a coincidence that these are the best performing states. In 1941, 55% of the people in Kerala were literate, which was higher than any other region in India. 4 times higher than the Indian average and comparable to some European countries.
To summarize Ben's position, Kerala's exceptional literacy rates are misattributed to the work of the Communist Party and other governmental institutions. According to Ben, Kerala's advanced education is merely a vestige of the Christian missionaries and the educational campaigns they enacted during the colonial period. To quote Ben directly, "This is not because of the Marxists, this is not because of the government, it is because of the missionaries." Furthermore, I will quote the study which Ben cites as evidence for this claim. Scholars often attribute the high education rates in Kerala to their post-colonial election of a Marxist government. However, this does not explain the high education rates in Kerala during the colonial period. The problem with Ben and Robert Woodbury's position here is that it rests on an extremely rigid ideological foundation. Instead of offering a comprehensive and nuanced perspective on the various factors which have contributed to Kerala's educational development, they exclusively highlight the missionaries while dismissing the abundance of evidence which paints a more complex picture. It is not my intention to offer the diametrically opposed and equally biased position which dismisses the missionary period and attributes the achievements solely to the Marxists. Instead, I will provide a more principled and balanced view of Kerala's educational history, which is also far more consistent with scholarly consensus. To deny the contributions of the Christian missionaries would be simply ridiculous, and Communist Party member and former finance minister of Kerala, Thomas Isaac, illustrates this explicitly. Any narrative of the emergence of public education and health systems in the state should begin with missionaries and royalty starting from the early 19th century royal edicts. Education and healthcare were also part of the evangelical mission of the Christian missionaries, and they set up the pioneering modern health and educational institutions, which came to be models for future interventions by the government as well as community organizations. This statement comes directly from a prominent member of Kerala's Communist Party, who lauds the contribution of the missionaries, but also mentions that this merely laid the foundations for future literacy campaigns enacted by the government. This is the level of objectivity absent from Ben's flippant assertions. While we can acknowledge the positive contributions of the missionary period, we must also critique the areas in which it fell short and also recognize the other factors which made Kerala's literacy rate what it is today. To do this, I will cite several academic journals and studies to corroborate this. First, I will refer to a study on Kerala's human development by G.K. Leighton, who holds the Child Labor Chair at the University of Amsterdam and the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. He is also the director of the IREWOC Foundation and a visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development. You will notice this study makes regular reference to the EMS government, and this refers to the communist administration headed by EMS Namboodiripad. EMS pioneered many of the educational reforms enacted by Kerala, which contributed to its high development. Leighton contradicts Ben's position by stating that the private sector, particularly the education provided by the Catholic and Protestant church organizations, is usually credited with introducing the best educational system in Kerala in the pre-communist period. However, he goes on to say that the role of the state in the process has not been given due attention. He then goes on to highlight the monetary contributions of the state during the communist period by stating that in 1957 to 1958, the share of the government and the total educational expenditure was as high as 80.6%, which is even higher than the 65.6% at the all India level. Leighton then highlights the issues regarding unequal access to education during the missionary period by stating, the reorganization of the educational system was needed because education remained the privilege of specific castes and classes, and he refers to the fact that lower classes and Muslims received far less education access. He then explains that the missionary period had a definite class and caste bias around it, and that the much applauded system had thresholds that could not be overcome. The study then goes on to highlight the contributions of the communists, stating that the changes that were introduced during the first EMS government formed the matrix of the further political and social development of Kerala, and specifically mentions their expansion of library movements. It goes on to explain that the underclass was brought into the spectrum of education following political intervention, and that following the election of the communist government, there was a precipitous decline in the number of privately run schools and a comparable increase in government schools. And as a result of this development, within 1 decade, primary school enrollment had doubled and enrollment in the secondary schools had tripled. And one final quote from the Leighton study, it makes reference to the overall progress of literacy in Kerala following the communist government, stating that literacy in the state was already high, but faster growth occurred in the period immediately following the communist EMS government, and that literacy rates of females more than doubled, and literacy rates of males almost doubled in the period between 1961 and 1971. Ben's position is further invalidated by a comprehensive report on Kerala carried out by the United Nations, which states that Kerala's literacy rate has widened since 1961 at a greater rate than other states, and furthermore, this disparity cannot therefore be attributed entirely to Kerala's preeminent position in the past, meaning the missionary period, and that furthermore, it is not only the stock of literates, but also the current flows of the educational system that contribute to a higher rate of literacy in Kerala. The UN continues to say, Kerala's progress in the field of literacy must therefore be attributed to the broad base of its educational system, and concludes that the tendency towards great equality in levels of education is, of course, the result of policies followed consistently by successive governments of Kerala, particularly during the past few decades. Yet another study damning to Ben's position is titled Literacy Movement in Kerala, 1 Step Forward, 2 Steps Back, which highlights more recent campaigns Kerala has undergone to achieve total literacy. And just for the record, that 2 steps back part refers to the right-wing government undoing the progress made by the communists as they alternated power. This study examines the successes of Kerala's 1990 total literacy program, which was targeted against mass illiteracy in the country. And this campaign is now widely accepted as the most effective way of achieving mass literacy. And the study cites the program as an inspiration for other states, such as Goa. It also praises Kerala's Ernakulam district total literacy program, which produced an achievement unprecedented in the history of the literacy movement in the country. Even studies that appear to be more biased towards Ben's position offer a more balanced perspective, which includes the undeniable contribution of the government. In this study, which explicitly suggests that the educational transformations of that part of the country was triggered mainly by Christian missionaries in the 19th century, it still must concede that as a result of government intervention, Kerala has witnessed rapid progress of literacy. The majority of this study covers the considerable contributions of the missionary period, which I do not deny, but the report concludes that the formation of the state of Kerala in 1956 resulted in the educational uplift of the backward regions of Malabar thanks to a patriotic fervor in favor of united Kerala, political compulsions, and an unprecedented expansion of literacy in all parts of the state and among all sections of the population. Even in the studies most amenable to Ben's position, there is an explicit recognition of the unprecedented expansion of literacy in Kerala following government-instituted programs. To conclude this portion detailing Kerala's historical literacy progress, Ben made the flippant assertion that Kerala's exceptional literacy rate is exclusively the result of Christian missionaries, not because of the Marxists or because of any government intervention more broadly. This position is extremely narrow-sighted and completely ignores the wealth of academic research that contradicts it. It also flatly overlooks the empirical data, which tracks the rate of literacy greatly expanding following the literacy programs enacted by the government. It seems likely that Ben has not done a great deal of reading on this topic and found one study that suits his ideological comforts and presented this as concrete evidence.
This was because of the missionaries, and you can still see the effects of this today. Kerala and Goa have lower concentration of Hindus and higher Christian populations, and this heavily correlates with the Human Development Index.
Ben goes on to say that the effects of the Christian missionaries are still visible in present-day India. And furthermore, that the concentration of Christians is heavily correlated with human development. When Ben refers to the concentration of Christians, what he's referring to is the overall amount of Christians in a state's overall population. Unfortunately for Ben, the data does not necessarily substantiate this claim. Now, while we can recognize that there is a vague association between above-average Christian population and a reasonably high development in India, there are many details which prevent this correlation from being anything near causal. Now, when I say above-average Christian population, I am being extremely generous, considering the overall Christian population in India is only 2.3%, so anything above 2.3% is technically above average. Keeping all this in mind, let's examine the details concerning HDI and Christian population in India. Let's first look at the Indian states which fall into the high development category. Kerala and Goa, which we have already discussed in this video, have the highest HDI ranking in the entire country. While both of these countries do have an above-average Christian population, they only represent a minority of the population at 18 and 25% respectively. The next two states for high development are Chandigarh and Delhi, both of which have less than 1% Christian populations. In fifth place, we have Puducherry, which, while technically being above average, only has a 6% Christian population. In sixth and seventh place, we have Lakshadweep and Himachal Pradesh, both of which have less than 1% Christians. Lakshadweep is interesting because it is actually almost entirely Muslim. The last Indian state listed as high development is Sikkim, which does have a slightly larger Christian population at 10%. Just to summarize this data, what we can see is that not a single nation in the high development category has a Christian majority, and half of those listed in the category have less than 1% Christian populations. The remaining states of India fall into the medium development category, and the top 4 states in this ranking all have less than 1% Christian population. Finally, tied for 12th place, we find the first Indian state which has a Christian majority population, Mizoram, at an overwhelming 87%. Despite having an extremely concentrated Christian population, Mizoram lags behind many Indian states with overwhelmingly Hindu populations and negligible Christian demographics. This disparity seems contradictory to Ben's claim that Christian concentration is heavily correlated with higher HDI. The only other 2 states in India with majority Christian populations come in even lower than Mizoram, with Nagaland ranking 16th and Meghalaya even lower at 21st out of 33 states. When we take a closer look into the overall Christian populations of each state, we find that the states with the greatest concentration of Christians fall far below many states with virtually no Christians. Kerala, Goa, and many other higher HDI ranked states certainly contain a slightly above average Christian population, which again is only 2.3%, but also some of the lowest ranked states in the entire country also have a slightly above average Christian population. As we have seen from the statistics, the Indian states with the highest HDI ranking have minority to non-existent Christian populations. It borders on the absurd to suggest that these overwhelming minorities are solely responsible for exceptional HDI within the state. These type of fallacious extrapolations lead to extremely inaccurate conclusions. If I wanted to make a similar correlative generalization, I could bring up the fact that Africa, statistically the least developed continent, has a majority Christian population, and the lowest ranked nation in Africa has a majority Christian population. Furthermore, 4 of the lowest ranked nations in the world, South Sudan, Mozambique, the Central African Republic, and Burundi, all have Christian majority populations. Now, just for the record, I do not believe Christianity is responsible for the underdevelopment of these nations or Africa as a whole. I'm simply pointing out that we can make all kinds of generalizations using correlations that are completely useless in terms of actually understanding anything. With all the erroneous correlations aside, what it really comes down to is that HDI is a multifaceted issue. And if we want to identify a more reliable cause of HDI, we don't have to rely on these flimsy associations. Instead, we can simply read the studies that directly examine the topic. For example, a 2019 publication from the IMF titled Multiple Dimensions of Human Development Index and Public Social Spending for Sustainable Development straightforwardly identifies a causal link between robust public spending on education and healthcare, as well as publicly funded social protection programs and higher HDI. This perspective falls squarely in line with studies that specifically focus on Kerala's HDI progress. For example, in a study titled The Kerala Model of Development and Sustainability in the Third World, it states straightforwardly that the HDI progress was accomplished by the elimination of absentee landlords and the return of the land to the tiller, and large amounts of funds spent on education, healthcare, infrastructure, agricultural credits, and housing. Staples were made available to the poor at subsidized prices. The Kerala model may be taken as an early prototype of sustainable development because of improvements in the quality of life, environmental stability, social and economic equality, and the decline in political strife. I know that as an ANCAP, it must be really hard for Ben to digest the fact that socialized medicine, public education, land reform, and robust social welfare programs are the greatest indicators for development. But this factor is consistent across the spectrum of examples, whether it's Kerala with the highest HDI in India, Cuba, which we discussed earlier, and many of the European nations which top the rankings of HDI. All these examples reflect similar public initiatives resulting in relatively high development. For Ben, though, it is much easier to ignore all that and simply point at Kerala's 18% Christian population as the source of all the development. While I admit that the inspiration to this video was a somewhat juvenile debunking, that was merely the springboard for us to take a deeper dive into more respectable topics such as Kerala's history, political structure, and overall development. Furthermore, we covered HDI and its relation to economic structure and religious affiliation. But aside from all those specific topics and the fun of dunking on an ANCAP, this video's main purpose was to exemplify the way in which seemingly credible sources and statistics can be manipulated and packaged in a way that leads viewers to seriously flawed conclusions. I just took a 3-minute TikTok and made a 40-minute video refuting claims, and I have barely scratched the surface of the subjects we discussed today. If you have a personal interest in topics of history and politics, I hope this video has persuaded you to be a little more critical of the content you consume, especially when it comes from a short-form platform such as TikTok. Even this video that you're watching right now, which is over 10 times the length of the original TikTok we watched, with far more extensive sourcing, is still inadequate in terms of understanding the topics we discussed today. I would seriously suggest independently reading books and other academically credible materials to form your own conclusions. If you're interested in more principled content that is heavily focused on books and credible sources, follow Subversive History and subscribe to this channel, as well as checking out our Twitch stream, where we meet several times a week to specifically discuss books on history and politics. Furthermore, if you'd like to support this content in a very direct way, consider subscribing to our Patreon. So this was our first produced YouTube video, so we're going to be doing our best to improve the production value as we continue. If you're still watching at this point, thank you so much for sticking around, and stay tuned for more content soon. La salam. Stay safe out there, everybody.
So don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. Be a low style. Style got thrown out the car. Rise with subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Rise with subversive plots. Red